Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of Rural Socioeconomic Development. I'm your teacher, David. For this week, you will be tasked with describing the key social indicators in your case study area, whether remote rural or accessible rural, in terms of the following: demographics, schools, shops, health, any post office businesses, and transportation. You will also need to discuss any trends that are occurring and possibly state why. This is all part of outcome 1 of your report of an accessible rural or remote area of your choice. So how is the population changing? The population is growing faster in rural areas generally than in towns and cities. Many rural communities which are commutable from the major cities have seen population rises, while those in the west and remote islands have experienced population falls. These trends are continued to persist into the next decade. But we have seen persistent depopulation of these already sparsely populated areas like the western islands and the remote islands. The challenge is both the falling population numbers and changes to the population profile. There's several concerns over rising and aging populations in accessible rural areas, which would lead to development pressures on services, and we'll cover that more in depth. So generally, across the country, Scotland's population is aging. In 2008, 16.6% was age 65 plus. This has now risen to around 22-23, and it should rise to 26% plus by 2031. 9 out of the local authorities with the largest proportion of older people are rural, and remote rural higher proportion of elderly than accessible rural. Which we'll talk about has knock-on effects throughout many key areas of industries, businesses, and productivity for the region. So huge implications for local, private, and public service provision. So in terms of migration, many 16 to 20-year-olds often leave to continue education or improve career options or travel. But many return to live in rural areas to bring up a family while working in towns and cities. There is a lower proportion of the population in the age range 16 to 34 in rural Scotland, a higher proportion of people aged 45 and over. For the age range of 65 and over, we know that there's definitely a lower proportion of younger people in those areas. Also, there's an interesting trend where we have older people retire from urban and accessible rural areas to remote areas, and this may result in outpricing locals. There's also new developments as the COVID-19 pandemic continues. We haven't seen house prices fall too much yet in cities, but we have already begun to see exodus and in-migration within the UK towards homes in more remote areas. And this can be because perhaps there's less prevalence of the virus, or that's the perception, and it's why live in a city when you can be in a nice countryside area. So this figure shows the distribution of population by geographic area and the age distribution of rural areas compared to the rest of Scotland. We can see that it's markedly different for particular groups of the population. Specifically, rural areas have a lower proportion of the population in the age range 16 to 34, but a higher proportion of people aged 45 and over, which is what I covered before. You can also see that evidence, well, the last point is we can see this is definitely showing that age is 65 and up, a higher proportion of those who are 65 and up in these remote rural and accessible rural locations. And I was pausing there for a second because I was thinking it's a good time to probably discuss why this might be occurring. Recent evidence suggests that factors influencing migration decisions of young people moving out of rural areas could be, of course, higher education covered and employment opportunities, but there also could be more housing. A lot of these rural areas have not had the kind of accessible housing, either in terms of numbers or in terms of price, that meets the qualities that these young people need. You need a home in an area, or you need to be at the right price. The final factor of why there's migration of young people moving out of rural areas is public transport availability. Oftentimes, public transport is not as accessible, and owning a car is another expense. So we'll move on now to the next point. So as mentioned previously, net in-migration is determined by the availability of housing, employment opportunity, and good infrastructure. And if those key attributes are lacking, you will see perhaps more mobility within the younger populations. We know that most in-migration comes from Scotland and the rest of the UK, England, Wales in particular, and mostly younger than the resident population there. 47% in Scotland of people who come to Scotland are from the UK, and 67% of overseas migrants are ages 16 to 34. But this contrasts significantly with the fact that statistically 24% of the resident rural population is 16 to 34. So while we're getting a large numbers of 16 to 34-year-olds coming into the country, not a lot of them are going to the rural areas. And it's interesting, we've had continual immigrants coming in to make up for the other major factor, which is an aging population. So it would seem that at least in some form, Scotland is or will be reliant on migration for years to come. Of course, that's not the only way to construct an economic system, but that seems to be the trend. There is sometimes not a lot of houses or viable employment opportunities in these rural areas. I've said that before. So some interesting solutions that you might think, well, what is being done or what's being thought about is some economists ponder whether access should be given to young families moving into the area over older folks. While older folks have, the cash resources and the ability to move into these areas, and they don't want to drive as much, and they have the money to afford cars and that kind of thing. There's still this kind of push to have, before opening up a house on the market, to give private screenings to younger families. But this is hugely controversial because often it's seen as not fair from a free market perspective, a purely capitalist perspective, and the owner, it's argued, should be allowed to do what they wish with the property. So, of course, housing is just one issue, and why sometimes rural areas are less seen as less productive or viable or even important. Although these are subjective traits in some ways, and oftentimes you'll have advocates or people who study rural areas tell you that that perception is wrong. So how exactly does an aging population impact on economic viability? Well, if you don't have young people, you don't have the backbone of your workforce. So these are the people that are paying taxes, providing services, um, delivering boxes of food, or caring for pets, or the teachers in the schools, or the cares in the nursing homes, tertiary services, primary industries like fishing, agriculture. Who's going to come in and do that kind of work in these areas? If it's not young people, well, old people don't really need to. They've maybe are retiring there, or they are pensioners, or they have remote jobs where they don't have to leave their home. So anyways, it's a big problem if your young people are not involved in the workforce. You get then relocation or a decline of existing businesses. They say, hey, there's not enough people here for us to hire. We don't have any laborers. We don't have any employees. This is not a good place to have a business. And that means overall fewer jobs in that community or area. And that leads to further outmigration of working age population people. So they leave, they know that there's fewer jobs there. Oh, well, that's not a good place for my career or to establish myself. And then you get the further decline of few new businesses starting up because no one's investing there. So it's a kind of a vicious cycle, and it's almost a trap that can occur. So with an aging population, you have key social indicators that are influenced. So one is health, the other is transport. And with health, with aging people, they visit their doctor more frequently. They use more prescriptions. So they will need a good transport system, and we've seen that rural areas often don't have as much public service access, or they need a car to access them. So it needs to attract, also needs to attract healthcare professionals to these regions. And oftentimes, healthcare professionals maybe don't see the allure of being in remote areas. They also need more home care and care homes, and we can't use robots to replace the young people yet. Maybe that will happen one day, but not now. So you'll require a local workforce. As far as transport, older people are less likely to drive as much, and so they'll need investment in public transport to access shops, healthcare, and socializing. So in terms of education, schools, you need to have, schools are the backbone of a good education. You need a good school provision that attracts young families, provides jobs, builds the community. So much of the, I'm noticing now, of a community is built around, caring and giving services and upbringing for younger generations. And for accessible rural population that's rising, you would need increasing need for additional schools. So that puts pressure on the existing rural areas. And in the remote rural population, which is falling, you have schools merging, closing or merging, you have less subject choice and an adverse effect on the local community. So sadly, recent evidence does show that school children in remote rural areas do worse than elsewhere in Scotland in accessible rural population areas or urban areas. So look for these kind of trends and see what's happening in terms of education for outcome 1 of your report. So these are the kinds of services that you'll want to investigate for your remote rural or accessible rural area. You'll want to look at transportation. Are there good transport links in terms of access to services and employment, access to leisure and school activities? You'll also want to look at the relevant legislation that's impacting these and any organizations that are working in these areas, but those won't come until outcomes 2 and 3. At this point, we're identifying and maybe briefly explaining why some of these are occurring. Post offices, what kind of services do they offer? They often combine shops into post offices, and they are a good place of employment. So post offices can be highly relevant to these areas. Shops, they reduce travel time and costs. If you have a local shop, then you don't have to drive 30 miles to the nearest Aldi if you're in a remote area. Employment, these shops can offer people employment opportunities. Petrol stations, they have a low customer base, so they often have high running costs. And if there's increased distance between petrol stations, then fuel costs will go up, and that might deter people from moving to an area or staying around for a long time. And petrol stations are often shops in themselves. So again, employment opportunities or providing services or products. Okay, let's now look at the criteria for economic indicators. In particular, you'll be asked to investigate income, employment, land use, and business. So in terms of income, household income affects house type, house price inflation, number of cars that you may own, and also spending in shops and on other private services. So income per household or per capita is a very good indicator for your town or area that you're looking at. All of these have knock-on effects on service-based and consumption-based economic processes. And so my best tip would be you want to look at median or mean house prices in your accessible or remote rural Scotland town or area, and then look at the median or mean house prices in either all of accessible or all of remote rural Scotland, and then compare them to your region, and you can make a lot of informed value judgments on what is occurring then locally. Okay, so in terms of employment, there could be a limited range of further education, training, and jobs, as we've seen an outward migration of 16 to 20-year-olds and lower proportion of 16 to 34-year-olds. And so the remaining young people are then faced with, a dearth of services and colleges or educational opportunities, less teachers, maybe less resources. Employment is, connected to the difficulties in accessing housing due to these affluent commuters who maybe live in, do a lot of their contractors or white collar, blue collar workers who are doing all their work in big cities or the central belt, and then they come back to accessible rural locations. And there's maybe a lack of social and private rentals in those areas. They tend to accessible and rural remote locations have a lot less, apartments, a lot less flats compared to cities, and that's where young people usually get their start living before they move to detached houses or other bungalow kind of areas. There's poor services and leisure opportunities. They can be seen as kind of just limited in their entertainment value, or everything is happening in the cities, or also limited job prospects. And the older workers then may become less physically able. They may face redundancy, and they have less options for reemployment and retraining. So these are all things to think about that may affect, a community negatively or not. There are ways of thinking and perceptions about rural communities that may buck the trend and may be different, or people can find opportunities in some of these things. But this has been the narrative for these places based on some of the facts and trends and statistics that we see. So you want to think about all these factors when examining employment indicators, and think about these now will help you with your evaluation section of your report. So we want to look also at the types of businesses. Are they service businesses like hotels, restaurants, cafes? Are there healthcare services? You should have a kind of almost like an inventory. There's X number of these. Y number of these, Z number of these, and then we can look at the details of those and see what the trends are, and try to interlink a lot of these different components together in your report. You'll look at, there might be retail, construction, distribution, transport, manufacturing, or there might be a more skilled workforce that's dominant, financial and legal sectors, and the public administration. The public sector is the largest in Scotland, so it's often a good gauge of as a comparison metric to see how accessible rural and remote rural compare to the rest of Scotland. So you can find statistics for that in the Rural Planning Policy, the 2050 research findings, or Rural Scotland Key Facts 2018. Just make sure to scan your area for these kinds of businesses and report on the trends that you have discovered. All of these sectors may not be in your accessible rural or remote rural town, but it does give you an idea of what to be looking for. Okay, so as I said on the last slide, this figure shows the distribution of employment across sectors within each of the geographical areas, with workers in the public sector shown as a single category. That's because in all areas of Scotland, the public sector is the largest employing sector. And it's interesting to see the dark color of remote rural and then compare that to maybe the rest of Scotland, or accessible rural to the rest of Scotland. What really jumps out to me is this bottom category, where you can see that agriculture, forestry, and fishing is much more prevalent in the remote rural and accessible area regions, while there's other noticeable differences in these graphs as well. So something to keep an eye on and refer back to when you're looking at your area in focus. Okay, so lastly, for land use, you will want to pay attention to the following: housing, infrastructure services, primary industries, forestry, agriculture and mining, business development, retail development. You want to discuss trends. What is, for example, causing decline of housing among younger working age people? And is it lack of infrastructure? Is it relevant legislation that hasn't been passed? You want to look at what are the key employment sectors? Is it private services, construction, health, education? Is there a reliance on primary industries like fishing, forestry, etc.? What are the trends in terms of business development and retail development? And um, it's kind of a lot, but a lot of front loading in this first part of outcome one, but you'll be happy that you'll have kind of laid down um, all of the appropriate kind of mapping that you'll need to do for the latter half of the report, which is to evaluate a lot of these regions. Okay, so for this week, you'll want to describe the key social indicators in the case study in terms of uh, demographics, education, communication, healthcare, services, and transport, and discuss any trends that are occurring. So those you can post on a discussion board, but remember, you don't have to submit a finalized draft. I just want to see evidence that you are working towards your report. Trust me, it's better to get ahead than wait until the last minute. Okay, see you next time. Bye-bye.